Welcome to Neural Search Talks on location at Berlin Buzzwords 2023. Today we have as an interview guest Jo Kristian Bergum, distinguished engineer at Yahoo and responsible for a lot of the stuff that goes on with the Vespa search engine. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So Berlin Buzzwords 23. I think last year we saw a lot of sort of early enthusiasm about neural search. This year is more or less the mainstream. How do you kind of assess the state of neural search and where things are, what you're seeing here at the conference?
Yeah, I think last year I did a talk on semantic search and vector search in particular, and highlighted some of the shortcomings of using these. Especially, I mean, neural search is.
Yeah, you argued for kind of a hybrid solution.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, and especially when you have this in-domain versus out-of-domain setting, right? And this year, what changed is that we now also have better embedding models that generalizes better, even if you use single vector representation.
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of progress on the mini LM days.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one direction that I'm seeing. Especially these E5 models from Microsoft are really interesting. And this year, yeah, of course, there's a lot of buzz about vector search, vector databases. I think a lot of that excitement comes from ChatGPT, OpenAI embeddings, those kind of. It had made search more accessible for people not being in search, but then using vector representations and following these tutorials, and then actually getting some good result without firing up a search. And so what happens there is that we now have more technologies out there that can solve in quotes, search. So
you can get started very easily.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's interesting. There are a lot of talks that we've seen, talks from Elastic on their sparse retriever model, which is, I believe, is based on Splade, this learned sparse representations. So there's been really interesting to see. It's still, I think, if you ask me about the state of neural search across, there's still many organizations that are new to this, that are just getting into it. And I will argue that there's still a lot of room for the traditional types of methods, right? Yeah.
And so you gave a very nice talk in the main session about fine-tuning, about domain adaptation. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my talk or work on this is inspired by researchers and also your work on this paper called InParse, which I believe one of the pioneers actually in this direction. And this model, or these PromptGator and these different papers, what they describe is a technique where you use the large language model offline to produce synthetic training data. Right? And my talk was about actually to use that to adapt, no matter what kind of ranking method if you're using pure vector search or if you cross encoders, any kind of learnable ranking model, you can use this to generate synthetic data to train and adapt that model. And I think that's important because a lot of organizations or teams will start out fresh without click interaction data, right? Because they don't have the logging infrastructure up, and without human annotators, right? So, yeah, I'm thinking another interesting point to this is that you can do this completely offline, because then you are basically distilling the knowledge of these large language models and you're using it offline. And it's much easier than also to do output verification, and you can do batch. You don't have to worry about serving latency and so forth. Yeah, so I think it's highly interesting.
And so last year you argued for hybrid search. I think that was well received by the community, and domain tuning using synthetic data. Quality of the embeddings has increased. So are we now kind of converging to this pattern where you have like kind of high quality, dense retrieval, combined with lexical search in a hybrid fashion, and then doing a bit of fine tuning, and then that's pretty much the recipe for now for neural search.
Yeah, I think.
Or do you see like a lot of that we still have to cover a lot of grounds to really get
So on the ranking part, like the pure ranking of results and whatever, if you're going to present that result or if you're going to feed that into a generative model, which again will summarize the result, ranking quality is important. And I think, as we talked in the Vespa team, we talked about hybrid search for quite some time, where you combine both the traditional scoring techniques and the vector models, which have been quite successful when you don't have any kind of in-domain adoption, right? It might be that when you have in-domain adoption by creating this synthetic training data, maybe you are less dependent on these traditional signals, right? But I would still argue that from a technology perspective, when you're choosing some technology to build a search solution, there's also, we always talk about the ranking and the information retrieval collections, and that's important, of course. But then you have silly stuff like searching for a phrase or searching for an exact article. You have a lot of these different query cases, that we take for granted with technologies like Elasticsearch and OpenSearch and Vespa and things that you don't find in a vector search, right? Because you're not actually able to take a product ID or something like that and input it in the search box, because the vectorization of that, it becomes a soft match, right?
Exactly.
So I think on the ranking side, for a regular normal query like what is the weather in Berlin, the dense models or the neural search will do that pretty good. But if you are inputting some postal code here in Berlin, it won't know that postal code, maybe, right?
So makes sense.
Yeah.
So yesterday you were in the panel on which search engine to choose in the age of vector search.
Yeah.
Kind of the startups of that were just very small last year. Some of them received a lot of funding, so they were now like on the main stage, like Deviate and Quadrant. So there was kind of this dichotomy between the new vector search engines and sort of the established players like Solar and I would count Vespa also among that, Elasticsearch. So what is kind of the OpenSearch was not on the stage, by the way, but so how do you see the dichotomy? Are they catching up, or is there really like still a lot of ground to cover for them?
I think we have to look at this more holistically, right? I'm really excited about embeddings and deep learning and obtaining and embedding representations of unstructured data, right? So I'm really excited about that, because you can actually now, you have better models in so many modalities, right? Where you can represent that data as vectors, not only for similarity search, right? But you can add layers on top of that for classification, so many like image, photo, video. So I'm really excited about that type of revolution. So I think there's plenty of room for vector databases that are really focused on that area, right? But for the text modality, I think that still technologies like Vespa, Elasticsearch, OpenSearch has the upper hand compared to the new offerings from other vector databases, because they have all the flexibility, all the features that we are expecting more or less from a search engine, that it will be able to do a phrase match, that it will be able to do a prefix query,
or tweak your relevance
that
from
too,
all
right?
kinds of diverse signals, things like that.
And in that addition, like Vespa's benefits is that it's very easy to represent ranking. I mean, like I said on the panel yesterday, we've always been focusing about relevancy and ranking, right? So it's very easy to represent multi-phase ranking in Vespa. You can also have your embeddings produced inside Vespa. So it's an easier to get started experience. Well, some of the vectors databases, they really solely focus on getting the vector search part. Great, right?
So now there's kind of this conception developing that vector databases are like the memory for the future of AI. Right. And so I want to hear your thoughts on that. Is that a logical connection that you when you want to store kind of intermediate results to to template into your large language model prompts, etc., and retrieve, kind of have a memory for your models, that you really should use a vector, should use embeddings, or do you see that differently?
Well, I personally have some issues with the terminology here. I don't know who kind of came up with that term, long-term, short-term memory. I think there were some initial papers, but what my opinion is that you're actually storing text, right? The language model takes text as input, text as output. You could vectorize that, input and output and store it somewhere, but then you are doing a lot more like relaxed search, right? So yeah. I'm a little bit confused about these terms and how they get thrown around, and I think it sounds really cool. I'm not sure if you need a vector representation, an embedding representation.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's more like when you come from the information retrieval community, you have metrics of quality, and it really depends a little bit on the use case, which type of search will give you the best metrics of quality. And there's not like long-term, short-term memory for AI has some kind of special characteristics that always make
and it's also confusing for me because we talk about short-term memory, like if you have chaining and multiple invocations like LangChain, and then someone also uses the term long-term memory to mean the knowledge source, like then the database that you store your knowledge in, and you're retrieving from it, right? And you can retrieve information for the prompt for a question answering task using pretty much any technology, right? So I don't think that needs to be a vector representation. And for me personally, when we started to work on vector search in Vespa in 2019, and we announced approximate nearest neighbor search in 2020, back then we saw that, hey, these vector representations, they're great in domain when you're trained on the data, really outperform BM25. But when you look at Beer and other, they're like, oh, actually BM25 is even better, right? So then actually vectorizing your data, is then just a wasted, compared to a very cheap Lucene BM25 implementation.
So of course, GPT, large language models, have changed a lot. The sort of perception of the general public of what's possible, and I think the state we're at is very advanced already, and it looks like they will also change the future of the search experience. Right. We like to quote your 10 blue links tweet. So how do you see that that evolution of sort of using generative language models to actually communicate the search results to the person who's searching or having a question?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting direction. And my tweet was that we haven't really moved past the 10 blue links in the search interface. So it's more of a user experience thing, right? That my original tweet was about. I think you can enrich the search results in a way in the UX that you get a better experience from it. Like that could be relevant facets, how you're actually going to drill down into this result. For example, in e-commerce search, I think most of the facet implementations out there are terrible. In terms of conversational search, where you actually, ask a query and then the agent might come back to you, or the large language model will combine the results and give you a few other options. I think it's hard to get without, a lot of resources, right? Okay, so we will see this from Bing. I mean, it's already there with Bing. And when we're going to see this at Google, right, it's going to change the whole landscape of search, because then people will get used to that interface. And they will come to you, asking, can you do this? Can Vespa do this? All the CEOs in the world will be looking.
Yeah, that's already what we're seeing.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually,
So it will have a very significant impact on the industry, and there will be a high demand for having that type of interfaces. But it's still very challenging, right?
Yeah, it's early stages. It's early stages, but the promise of productivity improvement really seems to be there, right? Like,
and
consuming the information in a conversational interface seems to be much more efficient than the 10 blue links.
Right, but I also argue that, okay, but you don't want this for every type of query use case.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So there are a large fraction of Google search traffic will be purely navigational, right?
Yeah, navigational,
Meaning like
recall oriented is different, right?
yeah, so navigational basically go to Google and type Google in search bar, so Yahoo or whatever, right?
Yeah.
You just want to move to that site, right? So and that's thing I think is something we need to talk about more is around, and generally it's a lot of hand waving around this, but query understanding and query categorization, that there are different intents which might not fall into the same retrieval and ranking pipeline, right? So in the ER community, all the collections, they're basically all of them are tail queries, right?
Yeah.
And that's where our focus is, right? When we're comparing method A and method B,
right.
that's, but we are looking at tail queries, right? And so I would argue that a successful search implementation, whatever technology you're using, have to have some kind of query intent classification, right? What are you gonna do with this query? And what are the facets you're gonna
choose different strategies
exactly
depending on the query.
Yeah, exactly.
It's something that is partially responsible for the success of Google, that they've had a very good query understanding already for a long time. And in the enterprise search or sort of niche use cases, this has not been available. Absolutely, right? And so with this sort of more conversational search and using language models to digest and summarize the search results, is there any developments that you guys are planning in Vespa?
Yeah, so there's some user interface things here on the summarization, because I think currently the large language models, if you give them a prompt like 4K tokens, they will use like 50 seconds to actually produce something.
Yeah, the latency is a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So you could do that offline, but what we're doing to demonstrate this, we are building a new experience for our Vespa documentation search, where we're using a large language models to summarize with a carefully crafted prompt, and where we stream the response, so that we have the user experience that you can actually get the search result, start looking at the search result, and get a stream summary of the results with sources and attribution. But because of the streaming part, it's not natural to have that prompt inside Vespa, but we're definitely looking later this year to look at what we can do in terms of chaining and so on. Because in Vespa, we've already been into this chain concept, right? So you have a query coming in, and there's this chain of processing that is working on that query until you choose, okay, what's the ranking model you're going to use? How are you going to treat the query linguistically? Are you going to expand it? You can run a query classifier there. Then you go to the phases of ranking, and the same thing on the result. There's a chain of results. So that kind of chaining of query and result has always been the kind of core implementation in Vespa. So we'll see. But the large language model is also exciting from a query planning perspective, right? Where you say, okay, here's a user query. Here's my alternative sources.
To do the evaluation of the intent.
Yeah.
To some extent.
Yeah. But for doing that in practice, you have to cut down the latency of this. I don't care that much about the cost. Okay, so if someone could give me a really low latency with a much higher cost, for a lot of organizations, it would make sense, because
for query intent recognition, you need really under 50 milliseconds or something.
Even faster. Yeah. So.
All right. Berlin Buzzwords 23, today the last day. Are you coming back next year?
I hope so, definitely. I mean, it's a really nice conference. It has a nice balance between some research, not the pure research, but it's like industry conference. But I like it. It's a really good signal to noise ratio. I think they don't accept sales pitches or like just AI, or so I like that. I really enjoy it.
So it's really hard to predict these days where we'll be in 12 months from now. But if you have to make like a prediction for the Berlin Buzzword, which will dominate in 24.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I personally think we will see more, of course, on large language models and how to use them. I think we'll, like, just this year, there were 3 different talks, pretty much talking about the same type of method where you're using the large language model, again, with synthetic data. Right? And I think we will see more of that next year. I think we'll see more of the summarization and more of the summary. But you're still gonna see the old-fashioned, the Lucene stuff, the Elastic stuff. You know, all
It's
this
the
stuff.
foundational
It's
layer,
the
right?
foundational layer,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So
I
yeah,
totally agree.
yeah. So I'm really hoping to. This is my second year in person, and I really enjoyed that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Joe,
Thank you for
for
having me.
being in the show.
Yeah, it's been
Have
a
a
pleasure.
nice rest of the day here in Berlin.
I will.
So there'll be more interviews. Thanks for tuning in to Neural Search Talks from Berlin Buzzwords 2023. Keep you posted.